I appreciate the opportunity to be here with all you folks, such a wonderful group, and give her one more go, huh? Everybody ready to give her one more go? Over the years that I was involved in research, from the years, I spent 7 years on a ranch in Colorado and developed a huge interest in plants and animals and the relationship between the two. And I went back to school at Utah State University, and I was really interested in trying to understand not what animals eat and where they go, but why do they do that? Why do animals select the foods they do? Why do they go to the places they go in the environment? And so that led then to getting more and more interested in linkages from soil and plants to herbivores and human beings. So spent 35 years at Utah State University studying those kind of things, working with folks like you as the program went along. And then 7 years ago, I left Utah State University, retired, and my wife and I moved to the backwoods of Colorado, not in any town, time to think and reflect. And at about the time I left Utah State University, I was asked by a journal, this journal here called Appetite, which focuses on human food selection, nutrition, and health. I was asked if I would write a synthesis paper that covered the work that we'd done for the last 35 years. They wanted me to lay out what we'd studied in terms of livestock. Well, I didn't do that at the time I was asked. I wanted to do it, but I thought I don't want to write a paper about that actually. What I'd like to do is to talk about our attempts to try to understand food selection, and then I want to relate that to humans and our selection of food. And so it took me 7 years trying to read in the human literature and to understand, try to get my arms around this literature. It's vast. It's like the alpha and the omega, huh? There's no beginning, no end. There's been 600,000 papers published just on diet and diet-related diseases alone. 44,000 were published last year. 44,000 papers in the scientific literature. Antioxidants, the last few years, 30,000 papers a year are being published on antioxidants. So there's no way really to get your arms around that. My colleague, this is where I'm going to start to get at some ironies. My colleague Juan Villalba was in over in Scotland last month, a couple of months ago, and he was participating in a conference on antioxidants. In other words, the people that are really doing the active, kind of the runners and gunners in the human area had pulled together this conference, and Juan went over to speak about some of the work we'd been involved with. And he said, you know, it's amazing because when you get at those kind of conferences and the people are being absolutely honest, they say, we really don't understand what role antioxidants play. Beyond that, every individual in this room is going to respond differently to antioxidants. Few of you may benefit from them. Some of you are going to actually be harmed if you take supplemental antioxidants. So there's this tremendous amount of work that's being done, but you have to wonder, you know, where is it leading? Well, are we really gaining some understanding of what's going on? I'm saying that not by way of critique, but by way of complexity in terms of what's going on, as I'll get into a little bit later on here. So there's that part of the whole deal, but then there's another part as I read in the literature, and a lot of the things that we typically say about the health benefits of one thing or another. For instance, omega-3s relative to omega-6s. Omega-3s supposedly are heart healthy, good for macular degeneration, good to keep your brain functioning. You start to read and follow that literature, and that starts to dissolve into nowhere as well. You start to realize that those ratios we talk about that are so sacred of omega-3 to omega-6, when people do double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, all that's vanishing too. There's really, you can make a strong case, there's no evidence relative to omega-3 or omega-6. People are writing synthesis papers and doing a lot of work about that. You also, in terms of all this business, get into the controversies that surround everything going on in human research, including sugar. You know, I mean, there's a lot of talk now, and I think for good reason, about harmful effects of sugar, too much for too long. But there was a paper, one that I found really, really insightful and interesting because of its honesty. And it was written by a lady out of UC Davis, published just last year. The title of the paper is Sugar Consumption, Metabolic Disease, and Obesity, the State of the Controversy. The State of the Controversy. And what she did so beautifully in this paper, in my mind, was to lay out what do we know from an experimental standpoint, what do we know about the effects of sugar on these processes? And then she laid out what don't we know? What don't we know, and how does that allow people, for instance, in the sugar industry, to continue to argue that there's no clear evidence that sugar is bad for you? So the paper's really insightful when you're starting to understand the nuance that goes on. And after spending 35 years in research, you appreciate the tremendous amount of nuance in terms of the way the studies are designed and what you can interpret from studies. So there's this tremendous amount of non-agreement on anything you want to look at. You can make a case for virtually anything that you want to make a case for, you can make it. So the controversy is a part. But beyond that, what's really was one of the more interesting things to me reading about humans are these placebo effects. You know what placebo effects are, huh? A third of any effect relative to taking something into your body, whether it's that water there or whether it's the food you eat or the pill you take, a third of the effect is what you think is going to happen. If you think that water is good for you, your body is going to respond physiologically as though that water is good for you. On the other hand, if you think it's bad for you, your body's going to respond and you can make yourself sick. Now, where does that come in? Gluten is a good example. Now, there's a certain part of the population, roughly 7%, if my memory serves me correctly, that has issues with gluten. But there's a much greater percent that think that they have problems with gluten, but when you measure physiologically, they really don't. But if you then offer them a food that has no gluten in it, as people have done experimentally, and you tell them it's got gluten in it, they're going to get sick. Am I making myself clear? So it's absolute kind of confusion when it comes to what's going on. You can make a case for anything you want to make a case for. So what I want to do as I go through this presentation is to talk about the things that we studied in terms of livestock and wild animals, and then I want to relate them to human beings and try to draw some comparisons and contrasts relative to my exploration of the scientific literature. I'm not doing this in any way that would be trying to tell you what to think about any of these things. I'm doing it by way of reflection, and hopefully you'll be able to reflect some as we go through the presentation and after. So, foraging challenges. You know, when livestock are foraging on a landscape, they'll encounter 50, 100, 150 different plant species. It's a huge smorgasbord. These plant species vary greatly in time and space in terms of their concentrations of these so-called primary compounds. And when I say primary compounds, I'm talking about energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, and secondary compounds. When I say secondary compounds, I'm talking about this huge array of alkaloids, terpenes, phenolics, cyanogenic glycosides, and on and on and on, that all plants produce. There's just this tremendous tens of thousands of these different compounds. So one of the challenges when we started out, and I'm going to make the case that there's a nutritional wisdom of the body. I'll go more into that. But one of the challenges and a lot of the pushback that we received when we started this work 40 years ago was that how on earth, given 150 plant species, is that mountain goat going to know which plants are causing which things in its body? How is it going to know if it needs some more of a mineral like phosphorus? Or how is it going to know if some particular terpene is what's making it sick? And people said, there's just no way that that can happen. So there's no way that there can be this wisdom of the body. When it comes to humans, the challenges that we've created, and I couldn't help but think over and over again, we truly are our own worst enemy. We take things that are as simple as eating a meal and we make them so incredibly complex that nothing on earth can actually figure it out, you know? We forage in fast food outlets and the aisles of supermarkets with many potentially toxic items, all attractively displayed, huh? These foods appear nutritious, but they can be just as toxic and deadly as any of these kind of poisonous plants and other ones. Now, here's what gets interesting to me. Nobody has to tell a bacteria, a wild insect, a fish, a bird, or a mammal how to eat, develop, and replicate. They know how to do every one of those things, and they do them successfully. They have for eons, or they wouldn't be here. Even the lowly laboratory rat, given a choice, can rectify sodium, calcium, and magnesium and amino acid deficiencies by selecting appropriate diets. Beyond that, rats rendered diabetic voluntarily select diets void of carbohydrates, consuming proteins and fats. In other words, they're doing the right things, and nobody's telling them how to do that. Consider the irony now. People have to be told by authority figures of one sort or another what and what not to eat. For the most clever of all species, isn't that ironic, huh? That we need to be told. So the question we raise in this paper for appetite is simply this: do people lack the ability to identify and choose nourishing diets? Have we lost that ability? Or has that ability been hijacked? And that's what I want to pursue as I go through the presentation today. As I mentioned yesterday, there are three facets to this wisdom of the body. And they're all interrelated with one another. It doesn't work if one of these in the three isn't there. The first one, and I'm going to talk a bit about each of these today, is what I refer to as flavor and feedback. And that's the basis, that's the foundation. That's the relationship between what we like to eat and what our body needs. Without that, none of this would work. But none of it works unless there's a variety of foods for animals to choose from. Without the appropriate variety, it doesn't matter if you have the ability, it's not going to be manifest. Now, in domestic animals, they're social. They form cultures. They form extended families if they're allowed to go wild. And learning from mother in utero and early in life is really a critical part of their ability to figure out what and what not to eat, what works out in those environments. So all three of those things are critical, and I want to talk about them and then relate it to humans. So if I were to ask you why you like a particular food, what would you tell me? Tastes good, right? If I ask you why you don't like a particular food, what would you tell me? Odds are you'd tell me it tastes bad, right? But what I'm going to try to get you to think about here is that palatability is more than a matter of taste. It involves feedback, and these feedbacks are in response to primary and secondary compounds in the diet. But if you think about why any creature eats, what is that creature feeding? What's being fed? Where does food go? Ultimately, it goes to cells, right? It goes to cells. That's what's being fed. And feedback is coming from cells, from bacterial populations in the gut. They're feeding back to ensure that we like the things that they need. You can think of a cell here. How does it forage? It can only forage on what I provide it. And it forages when these primary and secondary compounds are traveling along capillaries, and it's picking from these thousands of receptor sites that are on the outside of the cell. It's foraging. And this feedback is what's happening with that. Now, I'm not going to encumber you with tons of data at all. I'm going to simply tell you how we came about. We struggled for years and years trying to think about how would you demonstrate to people that are incredibly skeptical of this notion of nutritional wisdom of the body, how would you demonstrate that to people in ways that they would have to take notice of it? And the best way we came up with is as follows. We would make animals mildly deficient in the nutrient we were interested in. And I'll show you later on, we looked at the whole gauntlet of things. Then we'd put animals in two groups. On odd days, animals in group 1, we would feed apple-flavored straw for a meal, 30, 45 minutes. Animals in group 2 got maple-flavored straw. After the meal, we'd take a stomach tube and drench them with water. Now, that only makes sense in relation to what we did on even days. We'd switch the flavors, and now, following that meal, we would drench them with the nutrient that they're lacking. Then we'd simply ask the animal the question, if we make you deficient in this nutrient and we give you a choice between apple and maple flavored straw, for animals in group 1, which should they prefer, apple or maple flavored straw? They should prefer maple, right? And the ones in the other group, apple. That's exactly what they did, and in no uncertain terms. They were telling us that that's what mattered to them. So this whole idea of feedback becomes so critical in what's going on with selection and with liking for the foods. That's how the body causes animals to like what it needs. Now, rather than showing you data, I'm simply going to show you how that looked when we did these. This is just a very short video segment. You'll see two groups of sheep. One group, after they ate straw, was drenched with the nutrient they were lacking. The other group was drenched with water. And you'll see that there's a big difference in terms of their liking for the flavored straw, or for the straw. So it's clear, huh? The one group loves it, the other group can't figure out why they like it. And I'm jumping ahead to where I want to go, but that's exactly what the food industry has done with processed foods right there. Just what I showed you is what the food industry has done using energy as the feedback part of that. But before we go there, when we were doing this work, I was reading in Reader's Digest one night. It had taken us a long time to try to figure out how to do this, and Dave Barry had this short little thing. He says, what are calories? He says, calories are little units that measure how good a particular food tastes. Fudge, for example, has a great many calories, whereas celery, which is not really a food at all, but a member of the plywood family, Provided by Mother Nature, so we have a way to get onion dips into our mouths at parties, has none. That's the whole point. But do you get the point that it's feedback that's driving this? It took me forever when we started to do this to wrap my head around the fact that what I like is being driven by all these feedback mechanisms. That's really the key point. To make a very long story short, we worked for many, many years, published hundreds of papers on this stuff, looking at does feedback from primary compounds, energy, protein, minerals, and now our colleagues in Australia have shown vitamin E. In all those cases, you make animals mildly deficient, they respond really strongly. They tell you that they want to go for the flavor of straw that's been paired with what they're lacking. And they can do it given multiple contingencies. So if they've been exposed to calcium, phosphorus, all these mineral here, and they've been paired with different flavors, and then you make them deficient in one of those minerals, they're going to select the flavor that was paired with that mineral, if that makes sense to you. They're learning internal states, and they're learning how to rectify those. Then we went on and we did a lot of work with the secondary compounds. And the point I want to make for both primary and secondary compounds is simply this. Everything depends on dose and interactions, relationships. And so energy, protein, it's ratios of those that matter. Minerals, it's combinations of those. Secondary compounds in too high concentrations are actually toxic, but so is energy and protein and minerals. Everything's a toxin. It all depends on the dose. And so we realized it's relationships, and it's not relationships just among primary compounds or secondary. It's all those things interacting with one another that's influencing what's going on. It's very, very high order kind of interactions, and the body's integrating all that information. We also, with regard to the secondary compounds, really got interested in medicine effects. If animals are sick, can they learn to rectify sickness? And this book here, some of the first chapters, Nature's Pharmacy, Food, Medicine, Self-Medication, talks about some of the work we did up to that point. These are the chapters in the book, right on down to getting high, psychological ills, family planning, and facing the inevitable. And that may sound strange that would be in a book like this. But when you start to read what Cindy's talking about on how animals keep themselves well and what we can learn from them, you realize that when there's a diverse array of plants in a landscape, that is nature's pharmacy, and animals learn how to utilize that. These are all studies we did looking at self-medication in animals, and every one of those cases. And what we learned as well is that animals take different medicines for different sicknesses. When an animal has too much oxalates, they're going to go for the flavor that was paired with dical and so on and so forth. And we also worked with tannins, terpenes, and alkaloids with regard to internal parasites and self-medication for those. So the point is, animals are able to self-medicate when they're not feeling well, huh? It's the bottom line of this whole deal here. When it comes to complexity, and this is where, I mentioned the oxalates, and you've got 30,000 papers a year that are being published, and you go to a big conference of the heavies that are working on oxalates, and they say, we really don't understand what all's going on here. What you come to realize with this kind of complexity is that during a meal for an herbivore or a human, where you eat 5, 10 foods, whatever you eat, you've literally introduced tens of thousands of these primary and secondary compounds into your body. They're interacting with one another and with cells in extremely complex ways that we're never going to understand, because reductionist science isn't equipped, and I did that my whole career, but you finally realize there's a point where you're jumping off and you have to make a leap of faith. And what's amazing is that we'll never be able to study it, but it's something the body handles meal in, meal out, without one thought. You don't have to think about any of that. How many of you are sitting here thinking about which enzymes to release to digest the meal you ate this noon? Usually there's one or two, but mostly there's not. We don't do that. And it's the same thing with these feedbacks. That's not at a conscious level. We try to analyze these things with the cognitive, rational, analytical parts of our brain, but they're not that. They're non-cognitive, synthetic, and intuitive. They're happening automatically, and the body knows what to do with this. That's the miracle of that whole deal. Now here just quickly, there's some of the primary compounds in spinach, some of the secondary compounds in oregano, just to make this point come real to you. Now start thinking about a meal as I've been talking. So to sum up, what I'm saying then is that flavor feedback interactions involve these phytochemicals interacting with cells and organ systems in a dynamic network of communication that really unites cells and organ systems with the environments where a creature's living. These relationships we know, and I'm not going to bog you down in details of this, but we've learned a lot about how these are mediated with nerves, neurotransmitters, hormones, and those are the signals that are coming out that are changing liking in terms of need. And that's what enables the nutritional wisdom of the body. Now, when you look at humans, so now, remember, I'm trying to review this literature on humans and trying to say, so what abilities do we know that we have? When you look outside the laboratory in real life kind of settings and you read accounts of things, there's good evidence that we have the ability. When we have different states like these that I've listed here, including things like lean meat diets. People develop incredibly powerful cravings for fat when they're on lean meat diets. People that have that primarily as their diet. The body's telling what it needs. You can't make it on just lean meat. Now, the food industry, though, has learned how to make products really desirable. And I mentioned young kids. That's where you want to start. You really want to start as early as you can. If you can start in utero, so much the better. And I'll explain why as I go along. But early in life works just as well. So you target kids. You link familiar flavors. You link a familiar flavor with high fructose corn syrup to do two things. One, lure kids to a novel food by dressing it in known and liked flavor, and then you reinforce it with a blast of energy. And that conditions really strong preferences. That's what I was showing you when I was showing you those lambs that love straw versus the lambs that don't. That's exactly what we've done, is that kind of a setup. Now, there are two kinds of cravings, and this is really interesting to me. When I Googled this, you'll find millions of hits on cravings, but when you read what those cravings are, they're for foods and drinks high in refined carbohydrates that are established and maintained by chronically high levels of insulin, hyperinsulinemia, which signals the body to use glucose rather than fatty acids for energy. So the cravings that we would be studying with livestock in the sense that I'm talking about are a totally different kind of craving than this one here. What we've done is to extract and purify these primary and secondary compounds to amplify their effects. That's what's happening with high fructose corn syrup, which leads to addiction then. And these are examples related to foods, to alcohol, drugs, and food. And there's good evidence that we form addictions for refined carbohydrates. And there's evidence related to sugar. In fact, studies have been done with people, but studies that have been done with rats that are addicted to cocaine or addicted to sugar, given a choice between the two, they prefer the sugar to the cocaine. Dose and rate of release make the poison. I've been told that you can chew on a cocoa leaf all day long and you get mild stimulation, but you get no addiction. There's no hint of addiction. Where you get the addiction is when you extract and purify cocaine from the plant, and then you amplify that effect. It's the same thing when it comes to the refined carbohydrates. So flavor feedback relationships then are a critical part of this. The next part has to do with satiety, variety, and biodiversity. And I want to start out by talking about satiety and what that means and why that's important in terms of building on this idea of flavor feedback. And there are three explanations in the scientific literature that relates to livestock and wild animals related to why animals want to eat a variety of foods. One argument is that no one plant contains all of the nutrients that an animal can eat. The only way they can meet their needs is by selecting a variety of different plant species that are pulling compounds from different levels in the soil and so forth. In other words, all plant species are different. You meet your needs by selecting and eating a variety of foods. The other explanation is that these secondary compounds in plants set a limit on how much food any animal can eat. So if an animal needs this much energy each day, the only way that the animal can get there is by eating a little bit of food with tannin, a little bit more food with terpene, a little bit more food with cyanogenic glycoside, and so forth. Doing that enables detoxification mechanisms to handle the different kind of compounds. You're not swamping the liver or other organs involved in detoxification with any one particular compound. The third explanation is an attempt to integrate these ideas. In other words, if your cell here, you're not going to categorize what's coming in those capillaries as a primary or secondary compound. It's simply going to be compounds that are in that capillary. And so, say, forget the primary and secondary. What we're talking about is the integration of those things and these different compounds, and that when the mix of those compounds is right so that cells can get what they need, that leads to a deep sense of satiety. And this idea that I'm trying to say here is that there's a big difference between being satisfied after a meal and feeling full or stuffed or whatever it is. That satiety comes when needs are being met at a deep level in terms of not only the primary but these secondary compounds as well is the notion here. The other notion is that we get sick and tired of eating the same old foods, the transient aversion that Ray was talking about here. Creatures get sick and tired of eating the same old foods, and that's tied in with the relationship then among primary and secondary compounds that links back to our getting tired of eating the same old food and the same old flavors. So the idea here then is simply that eating any food to satiety causes a transient aversion based on the interactions of primary, secondary compounds. And that's, as I mentioned yesterday, why the grass is always greener on the other side, especially if it's a monoculture that's on the one side of the fence. It doesn't take long at all for animals to get sick and tired of that. And what I'm trying to argue here is it's not just boredom. It's much deeper than that. It's a lack of ability at a cellular level to meet needs for what that body needs in terms of primary and secondary compounds for nutrition, pharmacy, and health ultimately. So that's why, to me, many of the things that have been talked about here and the directions you're going make absolutely perfect sense. When you get variety out there, it's good for all creatures. So landscapes with diverse arrays of plants then are really nutrition centers and pharmacies. And I think nothing's more important for health through nutrition than eating a variety of foods, whether it's creatures above ground or below ground. And I mentioned yesterday that interacting with people at the Noble Foundation who are working with producers are telling me that producers find that morbidity and mortality of stockers decreases when animals go from monocultures to these more diverse mixtures of plant species. Yesterday I talked about that if animals don't have the ability to choose from a variety of different foods, they can end up over-ingesting foods to try to meet needs for nutrients that are in low, limited supply. And I used excess mineral consumption as one example. In this case, yesterday, these dairy cows really needed zinc, but they were being offered a block, and so they couldn't select the amount of zinc that they needed. When they were offered mineral-free choice, they were able to do that and meet their needs. But they were put in a box because that block initially didn't allow them to really select the amount of the nutrient they needed. I went on to talk about mixed rations versus free choice and argued the same things happens. When you create a total mixed ration for the average individual, there's no individual that's average. So some are going to need more, some are going to need less of what's in there. So livestock end up, the point was they eat more when they aren't given choices that enable them to balance their own rations. One of the more interesting papers I read in the human literature, I think these people hit it so on the head. They were saying that nutrients, don't even waste your time trying to focus on nutrients. Sure, we get nutritional deficiencies, but that's probably rare and creatures can figure that out, even humans. So they're saying that it's foods, not nutrients, that are the basic unit in nutrition. We need to be looking at foods and what food provides. For instance, in this example here, that top picture is garlic. And if you buy garlic capsules, you're not going to get 100, 200 different compounds that whole garlic has. You're going to get a handful of compounds at best. And it's synergies among these compounds where the action is. It's not individual compounds. But beyond that, it goes to combinations of foods. That's really where the action is. It's in different combinations of foods. And I mentioned yesterday that when the shepherds are moving their animals amongst those different sectors as part of a grazing circuit, they're not thinking about individual foods. They realize the action isn't with individual foods, it's with the combinations of foods that are in those different sectors and how that relates to the needs of the sheep as they're doing their circuits. Really critical point, I think, from my standpoint. So, assuming the foods on offer meet needs for energy, protein, minerals, and other phytochemicals, satiety leads then to a contentment and a lack of cravings that cause animals to over-ingest foods. That's where you get into problems, though. Food systems based on quantity, and a lot of what we've done is quantity, not phytochemical richness, which would be the richness of all these compounds, have a destructive feedback loop built into them. The more low-quality foods one eats, the more one wants to eat in a highly profitable quest to obtain nutrients in low concentrations. So the question then that we started to look at with this by way of background in the human literature is, well, is there evidence? Have people even studied this? Have they looked at, do we actually eat phytochemically impoverished diet, or we do that, but do we over-ingest those in a futile attempt to obtain nutrients that we need that are in low concentrations? Hardly any research has been done on that. The best paper I read that addressed this question was looking at protein. Very nicely done review of the literature, and they were arguing that our intake of protein is low relative to our needs, and so we're probably over-ingesting energy to get the amount of protein that we need. The other had to do with minerals, but it wasn't so nicely done. It was waving the arms and saying, look, we may indeed, and they were marshaling what evidence there was, we may indeed over-ingest foods to try to get minerals in limited concentration. So not a whole lot of work has been done with regard to humans compared to what's been done with livestock. When you start to ask, too, which combinations of foods make meals most satiating, which combinations, you don't find much out there in the human literature on that. People look at individual foods, Dairy products, meat and poultry high in protein are satiating, so on as you go through that list. But nobody eats individual foods, huh? We eat combinations of foods in meals. So it's a huge hole in my mind in that whole human nutrition literature about what combinations of foods really satiate us. And most importantly, with livestock and humans, we're always thinking in livestock of how can we get them to eat more, to produce more. I think what we've really missed is how can we offer them foods that really cause them to satiate and to eat less but perform just as well. And the same thing would be for humans. How do we create meals that at the end of that meal you haven't over-ingested food, you're just totally satisfied? And if you start to experiment with that, if you start to work with your spouse or whatever and experiment, you'll learn that you can create certain combinations of things. My wife and I have looked at that. We're not worried about what's the chemistry of this, how much protein, how much this, how much that. It's simply what kind of combinations are really healthful and really satiating. And you'll end up eating less because your body is getting its needs met. Now, I talked a lot about herders yesterday and grazing circuits and the value of those. And so we were interested as we did this review, well, you know, has any work been done on looking at sequences? You know, is there anything, it's clearly a huge deal with regard to sheep, cattle, and goats, as the herders found. So we were wanting, and I mentioned yesterday, these biochemically diverse diets where you can set up sequences. I mentioned trefoil as an appetizer helps the fescue go down. Bitterbrush as an appetizer helps the sagebrush go down. We were interested in whether or not there's been anything done like that related to humans. And we did find work on that actually, and it has to do with this glycemic index and glycemic load, which are really ways to characterize the rate of carbohydrate absorption after a meal. How quickly is carbohydrate absorbed? How much do you spike insulin? A lot got talked about in the talks on insulin, and if you spike insulin, longer term, that can have really negative effects. Insulin's the hormone that shunts the carbohydrates we eat to fat storage as opposed to muscle. And so people have actually looked at that. And here's some data that people found related to how we eat. Food order. In other words, the sequence we eat foods in can reduce glucose insulin responses, which is going to reduce where the energy you eat goes. Where does that end up? For instance, drinking wine prior to a meal reduces GI of a meal by 15%. A little bit of wine does that. Adding organic acids like vinegar or their salts to foods lowers the GI. It's going to lower that response. Eating a high GI dessert at the end of a meal is a good practice, especially if you've eaten other kinds of wholesome foods before that, because it's going to lower the glycemic index and the insulin response. Eating food high in protein or fat before eating foods high in refined carbohydrates lowers the GI. So there's several things known about if you're concerned about glucose and GI, you can change what's happening by simply changing order. Meal courses can reduce glucose and insulin responses as well. If you eat salad before you eat the meal, it's going to change the whole way that it's going to change. It's going to lower the GI and the insulin response. If you want to really spike that response, tie into bread right off. You know, like at the restaurant, they bring you a big thing of bread, right? Well, what that's going to do is instantly spike. If you change the sequence a bit on those kind of things, you're going to totally change what's happening in terms of glucose and insulin responses. Meal patterns during the day have a big effect on glucose and energy. A high energy breakfast combined with a low energy dinner decreases hyperglycemia throughout the entire day, throughout the whole day, doing that combination. And it increases hormones that promote insulin sensitivity and increases satiety. So again, really interesting and I think worthwhile kinds of information related to sequences and combinations of foods and what they're going to do in terms of our response. Fasting, intermittent fasting, where you limit your meals during the day to a 6 to 8 hour period. There's reason to believe that can have a big influence in terms of all these parameters that I've got there, in terms of hormonal responses and a whole bunch of health-related kind of parameters that you can read there. I'll let it go at that. So sequences, combinations of foods, we can really change what's happening metabolically by influencing those. Variety is the other part, satiety and variety. In this book here, The Dorito Effect, Mark Shaxter talks about what's happened with food and the foods that we eat. And he makes several points, but two that relate to here. He says the foods we've eaten have changed in two fundamental ways. The flavors of plants and animals have gotten blander. The flavors of plants and animals have gotten blander. He says if you look in the old-time cookbooks, people didn't add a ton of spices to those plants and animals. Why not? The animals, the argument is, we're eating diets that had a rich array of phytochemicals in them. And those phytochemicals are flavoring. I'm going to go into this more. They're providing flavors and also this phytochemical richness that's important for health. We didn't need that. As we've moved toward TMRs and the machine kind of feeding of animals, flavors have gotten blander. On plants, I'm going to come back to that on plants and animals both. So what do? We add synthetic flavors to improve the taste of bland foods. As a result then, we've disincentivized real foods because they don't taste good, because they're lacking the phytochemical richness we need, and we've made junk food all the more desirable, and that's causing us to switch in terms of where our preferences are. We've heard a lot of wonderful presentations about the links of soil and plant diversity and so forth. If you look in the ecological literature, 30 years ago, people were doing a lot of study on resource availability, sunlight, nutrient, water, which are affected by all the things we've been talking about, that people have been talking about here. But resource availability is linked with soil health. The point that I want to make here is that is influencing not only the diversity of plants on a landscape, it has a huge influence on the chemistry. These primary and secondary compounds are responding in enormous ways that I'm not going to take the time to go into in response to the environment where they're growing. Sunlight, moisture, nutrients is changing the chemistry. So that links then with what we do. You know, there's been two really nice review papers written that I found as I was looking through this literature, pointing out that the phytochemical richness of the foods we eat has declined from 10 to 50% in 43 fruits, vegetables, and grains from 1950 to 1999. We've put the emphasis on quantity and off of quality. So it's a mess, and it has to do with the varieties that we've selected for. We've selected for growth rather than phytochemical richness, and it has to do with the conditions we grow those on, the environment where the plant's growing. You irrigate, you add water, you fertilize with NPK. What you do is you accentuate growth and you dilute nutrients. You accentuate growth, and that rapid growth dilutes nutrients out. In addition, we pick plants green prior to ripening, which also decreases richness. So, you know, it's hard to get kids to eat and adults to eat their vegetables, and it's no wonder. They're not worth eating, huh? They're not worth eating. If you put something, going back to the first point I was making, if you put a fruit in your mouth and there isn't a richness of flavor, that's your body telling you instantly, don't waste my time with this, basically, you know? I mean, that's where the flavor feedbacks come. It's not just it tastes good. It tastes good because functionally it matters. And when it doesn't, taste becomes the integrator of these signals. I was in New Zealand last month and spent some time with a guy named Pablo Gregorini and his wife and their three young children, 2 daughters and a son. And it was a really, really wonderful experience. Related to this, though, their kids eat vegetables like crazy. They get good varieties of vegetables. They grow them in their gardens. The kids are responsible. They like to do it. So Sophia, she's responsible for the squash or whatever the heck it is, and so forth. Each evening we'd have a meal. They'd pick this stuff fresh. The kids love it. It's not even a hassle. But when you look in the nutrition literature for humans, when you scour that literature, it's interesting. Nobody talks about varieties and how it's grown. It's not seen as a fundamental solution to this issue. I talk about certainly offering a variety of vegetables to maybe get a little bit of intake. That's been studied a bit. Hide vegetables in dishes. You know, they're worthless, so let's hide them in there and see if we can get people to eat something that's really not very good anyway. The one I love the best on the bottom there, flavor conditioning. Put a bunch of sugar on broccoli and get their intake to go up, huh? All these are missing the most fundamental point, that we've accented quantity rather than quality, and our bodies aren't interested. Intensive breeding has reduced flavor, but you know, there's some groups in this country that I learned about that are really trying to select for phytochemical richness and flavor. And some of the work's being done with strawberries, some with tomatoes and some other plants as well. It's encouraging to see what those folks are trying to do. And you know, I mentioned the chemistry and the complexity of the chemistry. Strawberries, there's over 5,000 volatile compounds alone that strawberry produces. Now what's interesting is that some of these compounds enhance the flavor. If you've got good varieties, you have these flavor enhancing volatiles that make things to our palate much more appealing and to our bodies as well. As a last ditch for many people nowadays in terms of what to try to select when you're in the supermarket, Joe Robinson has written this book that some of you may be familiar with, Eating on the Wild Side. And what it is, it's kind of a user's guide to what to try to look for when you're in the store in terms of colors and varieties and one thing or another. And I think the book is really good and it's a useful guide. But the bottom line is that whatever you buy, if it doesn't have a richness of flavor, that's your body telling. And it doesn't matter if it's organic or inorganic or what, in this sense of the flavor. You can buy organic stuff that's pesticide free, but it tastes as bad as the other stuff. So it's not about that. It's about phytochemical richness in terms of variety and how plants are grown. We further reduce phytochemical richness by extracting and purifying compounds and by processing foods. But neither the food industry, when you start reading out there, nor scientists who study food intake and preferences have really tried to make this link between obesity and not just energy and protein, but the total phytochemical richness of the diet. But there's no need to do that if your interest is trying to increase food intake as opposed to making satiating kinds of foods. You can scale up from this soil, resource availability to soil, to plant diversity and chemistry then to looking at the biochemical richness of the diets of herbivores themselves. And there's not a big literature out there on that as well. In dairy, I know of a couple of papers that compare dairy cattle over in Italy that are being fed a total mixed ration versus being allowed to be out on pasture. And what they were looking at is what is the phytochemical richness of that milk and cheese made from the two, and what do the Italian people prefer? Hands down, the phytochemical richness is higher when the animals are out there foraging on pasture as opposed to being fed a TMR. Makes sense. But the Italian people strongly prefer the cheese that's coming from pasture, huh? Their palates are linked into that. And when you go to France and some of these other places, their palates are so tightly linked that they would say, you know, I prefer Gascon's cheese coming from this little part in my village versus Michel's or whatever. They are really in tune with this kind of thing. When it comes to meat and milk, you can find, or to meat now, you can find some studies related to this topic, but not a lot, honestly, not a lot. We know that meat flavor reflects soil and diet, which is influenced by phytochemical richness of the landscape. If you hunt, if you're a hunter, if you've done that in the past, whether you're hunting birds or deer or whatever it is, I did it for years, you come to know that the flavor of those birds reflects seasonality and where they are in the environment. Same with the deer. There's a flavor that gets imparted. Yet, you know, you really don't find systematic studies to assess how that, where those flavors are coming from in terms of the phytochemical richness of the landscape, and what that means in terms of our health. Mark Shaxter wrote a book titled Steak, and he said the very best steak, it was one man's quest for the world's tastiest piece of beef. He said the best steak I ever ate in my life, the worst steak I ever ate in my life, all came from pasture. So there's a richness there that's affecting what's going on, and I think nobody's really looked at that. When it comes to red meat, studies don't emphasize the origins, where the meat's coming from. And so studies like this, and I reviewed several of them, red meat consumption and mortality, results from 2 prospective cohort studies. And they're critical of red meat. They're critical of it, you know, they're pointing out that if you eat red meat, you're more likely to die sooner, blah, blah, blah. But I think the key point here that I want to make is pasture isn't pasture, isn't pasture. Red meat isn't red meat, isn't red meat. We have to start looking at where it's coming from and what that means in terms of health of human beings. I found one study that I think is profoundly interesting and important, and there's no group, there's nobody that I know of worldwide that's even looking at this. And I think it so relates to what folks are doing when it comes to pasture-reared, pasture-finished animals and the implications in terms of human health. What these guys did was to ask this question. They said, look, we want to compare a native herbivore in Australia, the kangaroo, that's out there eating this diverse array of plants, these 50, 60 different plants on the landscape. We want to compare them with Wagyu cattle that are being fed a total mixed ration in feedlot. And the way that they did that was to do metabolic trials with people, where people were fed either the Wagyu or the kangaroo meat, and then they were looking at inflammatory responses after the meal. These postprandial inflammatory responses, as they're called, simply means after the meal. The key point here is that the differences were absolutely stunningly big. The inflammatory markers and the responses were huge when people ate meat that came from that total mixed ration in the feedlot. When they ate that meat that came from the kangaroo out on the pasture, there was virtually no rise in inflammatory markers. That's a huge, huge deal in my book. And yet, I don't know of one group that's interested, one group that's doing anything. If any of you, and Jason and I have been talking about this, if any of you are interested, I think it's a huge opportunity being missed in terms of what happens. Now, obviously, in this study, animal and diet are confounded, huh? Animal and diet, you don't know which is causing which. My bet is that it's mostly due to the diet those animals are eating. So what needs to be done is to look at cattle that are out on a phytochemically rich diet compared with cattle that are fed a total mixed ration, and to look at meat and to look at dairy and to look at these kind of responses. which are inflammations, what people talk about all the time now in terms of disease, is long, slow burns. And if you're eating a diet that's inflammatory, your likelihood of getting cancer and heart disease and so forth goes up. It's a really big issue, but it's a really big opportunity in my mind. I'm kind of wearing this out, but it's a huge opportunity that's being missed by not understanding that better. So we know that phytochemicals in meat, these secondary compounds, most of them are fat soluble. They end up in the fat. They don't go away, they end up in the fat. And we've heard talks on fat-soluble vitamins, how important they are in terms of eating fats. But what I'm saying is that there's this whole array of compounds I've been talking about that are getting into the fat that nobody's even looked at. And the way is to look at it as an integrated response by the human body. Don't try to look for magic bullets in terms of CLA or omega-3 or whatever it is. What's the body doing in response to the particular food? We don't know a thing about that. But this study to me is really, really important. Okay, so that's two parts then of this whole idea of, I've argued this flavor feedback is critical. It works in livestock. It's also there in human beings. The variety of foods on offer become really critical. We've done a lot of things to shoot ourselves in the foot in terms of what we offer. Not only the processed foods, but then the real foods that we're supposed to be eating aren't so great either, many of them. The last part's the social cultural part. And what's it mean for creatures to be locally involving in the landscapes that they inhabit? And I think of this often as how offspring learn from their ancestors through their mothers, basically. It's these transgenerational linkages, and that'll mean more as I go along here, that become really critical. So expressed behaviors occur within the context of ongoing adaptations in environments where creatures are conceived, born, and reared over many generations. When you look in the literature, these natal experiences affect a whole host of species. From earthworms prefer environments where they've been born and reared to other environments, right on through to about any creature you want to name. And there was a great review written several years ago that was just pointing out how critical this is for species. When you think about it, why is it important? It's the home field advantage. We talk about it in sports, but it's the home field advantage in life. Knowing what and what not to eat, where and where not to go, what's a predator, what's not a predator. All these things are learned. They aren't just necessarily innately a part of the creature. So this becomes really fundamental then to linking creatures with landscapes. In livestock, we spent my career studying these kinds of things. Mother's influence on what offspring choose, where offspring go in the environment, and it's huge. It starts in the womb, though. That's the key thing. And we did studies showing that experience in utero influences preferences for foods, ability to utilize foods. Mother's milk, the diet that mother's eating, the flavors of those foods are getting in the amniotic fluid. During the last trimester of gestation, the fetal trace system is fully functional. Offspring are already starting to experience the diet that mother's having. Flavors in the milk, then mother as a model, all these become really critical linkages. Very quickly, and I could show you several data sets here. I just want to briefly give you the flavor. We did a lot of work with cattle, and as adults, cattle and sheep exposed during winter to high fiber diets, think wintering out, and you want those animals to be able to really utilize high fiber diets well, poor quality. These exposures in utero and early in life enable animals to eat more, to gain more weight, to produce more milk, to breed back sooner than animals that are reared on high quality diets. Huge influences, and you can have something as brief as an exposure for a couple of months early in life. And in one study we did, the animals didn't see the food again. This was straw fed during the winter. They didn't see that food until they were 5 years old, so 5 years later. And throughout that 3-year study, all 3 years of that study, those animals gained more weight, better body condition. They bred back sooner than animals that had lacked that exposure. In other words, what we're doing is switching on genes. We're switching on genes that are enabling animals to better function in the environment where they're going to end up. In Australia, our friends there did work with a salt brush. Out in Western Australia, there's a lot of salt brush, much like sagebrush in our part of the country. Lambs exposed to salt brush in utero grow faster. They handle a salt load better than lambs from mothers on pastures. What's interesting, these exposures are changing kidney function. They excrete salt more rapidly. They drink less water to maintain higher intake when eating salt brush. So they've been changed then. The point is that environments influence gene expression, this whole area of epigenetics. The environment is influencing gene expression, which is changing form, function, and behavior. And you know, whether you're looking at the central nervous system, enhanced neural responses, or changes in rumen and liver and kidney function, all those have been demonstrated. All those things change as a function of experience. You know, it's interesting too in humans, I'm going to start to link this back. When you look at taste receptors, we think they're just in the mouth. They're not. They're in organ systems throughout the entire body, the lungs, the heart. All these organ systems have taste receptors. And that helps to explain why in cases like this book here, A Change of Heart, when the book is about a lady that had a heart transplant, and what they find is that when you put someone else's organs into your body, it changes you in a huge number of ways, actually. This lady got the organs of a 21-year-old male put into her body back in the day. So, but what happens is your preferences for foods change as a function of that. In other words, you've put cells that have different preferences into your body. And now in her case, she was finding that things that she never liked at all, she acquired really huge preference for. For instance, she was in the hospital recovering, and she was one of the first people to have these transplants. And she was on an exercise bike, and the media was in there interviewing her. And at the end of the interview, they said, you know, if you could have anything you wanted to eat or drink right now, what would you like? And she said, I'd like a beer. And she said, then she thought about it, and she felt really badly for two reasons. One, the flippant nature of the response. Two, I don't even like beer. And she went on to talk about how all of her food preferences had been modified as a result of these experiences. So we are linked in fundamental ways at the most fundamental levels of our bodies with this whole soil, plant, herbivores, and humans. Paul Rosen, who studied us forever, raises this question. He says, suppose one wishes to know as much as possible about the foods another person likes and eats and can ask only one question. What's the one question you would ask? What's the one question you would ask that would give you more information than any other question you could possibly ask? He says there's no doubt about it. It's what is your question of origin? Where did you come from? And then he goes on to talk about diets of people from around the world. And he says, you know, we vary from the almost purely carnivorous diets of people like Farley Moe was writing about in Canada, the people of the deer that lived on caribou. That's all they ate. You go to the tropics, they're plant-based diets. They're not animal-based diets. You go to India and France, and you have all these really elaborate kind of cuisines that have developed. And then you get to the Mediterranean diets, and I put that in there to make a point that I'm trying to make already. To me, it's so funny to read the diet books and to hear the advice, because it's like, this is the diet for you, huh? This is the diet for you. This is what you need to be eating. To me, I think about it's like asking the mule deer in the western United States, what do you eat? It depends where you are. They eat a whole array of different things, huh? No one diet fits all. The Mediterranean diet's interesting in that sense, because when two ladies over in that part of the world, researchers, decided to try to define what the Mediterranean diet is, when they tried to go around and look at all that Mediterranean area, what did they find? It doesn't exist, right? It doesn't exist. The Mediterranean people haven't heard of the Mediterranean diet. Am I making sense? They're all eating different things. So one size fits all never does, yet, you know, as I read in the authors of diet books, it's like this is the magic thing for you, huh? Everybody has an agenda, and our food preferences come the same way, though, in the very same way. You know, mother's influence in utero, early in life, are all having a huge influence. I knew of this study well before I ever started to do the work on this paper and trying to write this paper, but I still think it's a classic. And a lady named Clara Davis did this work nearly 100 years ago now in Canada, and she was working in an orphanage, and there were kids being given up for adoption, and she was just interested in the ability of a human being to self-select a diet that it needs to meet its needs. And so she took these kids from babies, and she offered them 34 foods, and they were able to choose whatever they wanted to choose. And she said it was amazing because kids didn't show any kind of an instinctive response to know what to eat. They sampled everything under the sun that was offered. They even tried to eat the utensils and the napkins and the whole works. There was no, but given a little bit of time, they started to really focus in on particular foods. Did every kid focus in on the same foods? No way in the world. They all selected a different diet, and from day to day they were doing just like our cattle when we gave them a choice versus the TMR. They're all doing different things. So none of them ever selected the same combinations, but the doctors were monitoring them over the 10 years or whatever it was of this study. They were all quite healthy. And when they came in with deficiencies, when some came in with deficiencies like rickets, they would select for what they needed to rectify that deficiency. So it's amazing studies that she did. She concludes this way. She says, by this time you'll all doubtless perceive the trick, if trick you wish to call it, is in the food list. She's saying confined to these wholesome foods as it was, it reproduced the kind of diet that our ancestors would have grown up for that led to really excellent kind of health. And so her final conclusion is that culture is what matters. Culture is really key in terms of transferring that knowledge. The results leave the selection of foods to be made available to young children in the hands of their elders, where everyone always knows it should have been. When I was in Australia last month and talking with some of the folks, they said some of the women that are having young children now are doing the Clara Davis approach. Maybe not 34 foods, but they're simply letting those young children dictate what's needed. They're putting that sort of thing into practice. Now, native peoples, when you read in the anthropological literature, when you start reading about what they did, they understood this. They provided really good diets to the prospective parents, the father and the mother before conception, and to the mother during pregnancy. What they were doing is carefully imparting their nutritional wisdom, ensuring the health of future generations. They knew this was really important. But that hasn't been the case in the last 50, 75 years here in this country. The foods available in the aisles of supermarkets and choices to be made are influenced not by mothers, not by culture that's grounded in health, but by corporate, political, and academic elders. And what's being transmitted now, unfortunately, is what we've done. Transgenerational metabolic syndromes. We know this is well documented. Mothers who gain excess weight during pregnancy, mothers who are obese, mothers who become diabetic during pregnancy are more likely to have fatter babies with higher incidence of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. All that, there's great data sets on that. And the physiology of that is known, and it's what you would expect related to what happens with anyone that's on highly processed food diet. Epigenetics and gene expression are what's being affected here. They're changing form, function, and behavior. So overweight mothers make overweight babies, make overweight mothers in a very vicious cycle. I've talked with some of you, you've asked about epigenetics, and just very briefly here, epigenetics is, if you think of the genome as the hardware, the epigenome is the software. It's what's interfacing with the environment, and it's doing it moment to moment, day to day, and it's what's allowing the creature to deal with the dynamism of the environments we find ourselves in. And if you want to watch a really great overview of what epigenetics is about, this NOVA special, Ghost in Your Genes, is no better than I know. It'll get you thinking in ways you never thought of before about how some of the things that you are now and what you might prefer and how you might be were influenced by perhaps your great-great-grandfather or your great-great-grandmother. These kind of epigenetic switches that turn genes on have transgenerational effects. The beauty is they can be switched on and off, both directions. And that's what this field's about, basically. And it's in all creatures, plants, animals, doesn't matter. Epigenetics is really an important way. One of the people in that movie says, for the first time in biology, we have a way of thinking about the world that's really up to the complexity and dynamism of what the world is. I couldn't agree more. So it adds a whole other way to think about then our ancestors, our mothers, ourselves. This little guy says, when I learned you are what you eat, I realized I was nuts, huh? That's the idea here. Two last points. One I've alluded to, but I think there's nothing more important than this, and nothing that flies more in the face of the diet books that say one size fits all. It never does. And it's this idea of individuality. If you look at what's happening epigenetically and every other way, what you realize is that, you know, people say nature abhors a vacuum, and that's true, but nature abhors even more sameness. There's no creatures on this planet that have ever been the same. No two ever. And it has to do with what's happening. Genes interfacing with an ever-changing environment. And then what's talked about in this book, The Triple Helix, is that there's an element of randomness, of chance, that enters in here at the molecular level. It's not some scary, bad kind of thing, but it's just that during development, when so many things are happening so quickly, a lot of times it's easier just to let chance play a role in what develops. So that combination makes it where no two things have ever been the same on the environment. Yesterday I showed data. I'll just make the points that livestock vary tremendously. Anytime you take the time to look in terms of diets that animals select, you can get as uniform a group of animals as you want, and they're going to vary in a huge way in response to primary and secondary compounds and what they'll select from that. Now that same thing, this book here was written probably 60 years ago by Roger Williams. It's not an interesting book to read, but if you want data galore on how every part of our physiology that was known there varies from one of us to the next, and that we're not even close to being the same, that's the book. He wrote an article for Reader's Digest years ago talking about average. He said, a group of people's like a collection of marbles of all sizes and compositions. Try to average these marbles, you come out with nonsense. You can, quote, average their color by mounting them on a circular disc and rotating it rapidly. Color comes back a dirty gray, but there's not a dirty gray marble in the lot. That's the point of the whole deal. I have a friend, David Mannix, in Montana, who tells it just a little bit different way. I'll be brief here, but he was on a field trip, and he went out to this rancher's place, crusty old rancher, everybody's out there looking, and what do you talk about when you don't know what to talk about with somebody? The weather, right? So he made the mistake of asking this crusty old guy, he says, so what's a normal year like around here? And the guy gave him a dirty look. He says, no such thing as a normal year, sonny. So now let me ask you a question. What's the average person like? So, I don't know. Average person has one breast and one testicle, but you don't see many of them running around here, do you? That's another way to make that same point. The average doesn't exist. So when people start to tell us, this is the diet for you, or this is the anything for you in matters physical or spiritual, It's an individual journey, huh? Each one has to figure out for themselves to rise to the challenge of what is it that works for my body, rather than having some authority figure forever saying, well, this, that, and the next thing. Now, that becomes manifest in these studies, and I love this, where people were comparing low carb, high fat with low fat, high carb from Atkins to Ornish. Within each group, some women lost 40 to 50 pounds, others gained 5 to 10 pounds, huh? And the ones that were gaining, I think probably like this one here. Inside me is a thin woman crying to get out. I usually shut the bitch up with a piece of chocolate, huh? You can go on to the exercise, and it's the very same thing. You know, you can do the same amount of exercise. No two people are going to respond the same way. So the last point that I'd like to make on reconnecting then is this. You know, we can go then from soil, resource availability, soils, plants, plant diversity and chemistry, but a lot of very nice talks on animal impact as relates to these things. And carbon sequestration was talked about as well. So those have been covered. You know, the point that I think strikes me, you know, a huge part of the earth is rangeland, home to 2 billion people who depend at least partially on livestock for their living. So managing, whether or not a person buys anything related to what's happening with the global warming part of things, managing for healthy soil just plain makes sense, huh? And we can play a role, as all of you have been talking about. And there are many, many different ways to do that. So that's been worked on. I want to throw out another thing that strikes me over and over again when I drive to Colorado Springs or Denver or to Bozeman or any of the towns that I'm around nowadays. And I'm going to kick off with this idea of ecological doctors, and I want to talk about Aldo Leopold for just a minute. But you know, when we wrote our book, The Art and Science of Shepherding, Tapping the Wisdom of French Herders, the first chapter we were saying really what we need to become, all of us, is ecological doctors, restoring the health of landscapes. And we were talking about shepherding, obviously, as the way to do that. And Leopold said this, he says, there's 2 spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocer, the other that heat comes from the furnace. To avoid the first danger, one should plant a garden, preferably where there's no grocer to confuse the issue. To avoid the second, he should lay a split of good oak on the andirons, preferably where there's no furnace, and let it warm his shins while the February blizzard tosses the trees outside. I think one of the huge things that's not talked about that could be done across the United States is to get rid of lawns and grow vegetables, herbal and medicinal gardens. That would not only help in terms of people feeding themselves, but if you get involved in the act of growing a garden, it changes your whole relationship with the environment. If you get into that, that's a personal act of growing your own food and starting your children growing their own food and growing healthful. Nothing, I think, can as simply recreate linkages as this humble act. Now, trying to get humans to change, that's a whole other deal about how to approach that. But that could be huge. Let me show you in terms of resources what that would mean. Over 30,000 tons of synthetic pesticides we put each year at a cost of well over $2 billion to grow lawns. Over 800 million gallons of gasoline is used to do that. The gas spilled, the gas alone that's spilled refilling lawnmowers is 17 million gallons, 1.5 times 7 more than the amount spilled by the Exxon Valdez off the shores of Alaska. Residential water use outside the home is 30 to 60% of total water use. Depending on the estimate, 7 to 9 billion gallons of water are used each day for suburban irrigation. And the cities become a black hole pulling resources from across environments. If you drive across Colorado now, you'll see so many places where the water rights to those landscapes were sold, and they're sold to the municipalities. It's a huge deal what that could do. From a personal standpoint, beyond growing your own food, and not only the vegetable, but the herbs. The herbs are providing huge array of phytochemicals, huh? My wife has really taken a lead role on medicinal plants. I mean, out in the landscapes and the plants that you can grow, and it's huge, and it's huge what they can do. And that idea of extracting and purifying and synthesizing is the same thing related to drugs. When you get into resistance, bacterial resistance, viral resistance, those kind of things, plants have devised ways through this diverse array of phytochemicals that it's very hard for bacteria to adapt to. It's very easy when you have a simple compound. Shop and create meals mindfully, graze your own food, buy wholesome foods if not, and so forth. This book here, Mindless Eating's a riot. This guy studies people like we studied sheep. And just very briefly here, he'll bring people into what they think is a normal restaurant. It's not at all. And he'll set them up to show how mindlessly we eat, how we don't even pay attention. We're so detached from this. And one case, the book never ends with them, but that soup bowl there on the bottom. So you come in and you sit at this table here, and there's bowls of soup. And you sit down and you're talking with your friends, and you're eating, and you're eating, and you're eating, and unbeknownst to you, there's a tube that's feeding that bowl from underneath. So the bowl never goes down. And, about 15 minutes into that, the waiter comes around, would you like the next course? No, I'm still working on my soup, and this goes on. It's mind-boggling how little we are attentive, how little we're aware and paying attention to what's going on in our environment. The bottom line from an individual standpoint is expose your body to a variety of whole foods and trust the wisdom of your body to select what it needs. Forget the authority figures. But this is my reflections. This is, to me, when you listen to all the million things that's going on that we try to study, it becomes mind-bogglingly complex, when in fact it's not at all. It's just let your body guide you, and that's all you need to do. Your body knows if you're exposing it and trying these different things. And then remember, like this guy says, remember the 20 extra years you added to your life through clean, healthy living? Well, these are them. We all gonna die, huh? And I often think as a society, we're so damn afraid of death that we do things that are insane to gain a few more weeks, a few more months at great cost to families and societies. I've seen people that have lived to 95 to 100. It ain't that great, I can guarantee you, in the ones I saw. It's like, anyway. So, to sum up, after I've finished reviewing the literature, spending 7 years trying to get my arms around it, still trying to work, I think this. In some ways, the forever incomplete, that's a cinch. We probably know about this much on something that's bigger than this whole town. The ever incomplete, and it's always conflicting. You can find whatever you want to find in the literature. Understanding of foods and compounds and health and the presumed adverse effects or beneficial effects of eating them is worse than no knowledge at all. In France, when you compare people over there and the way that they ate their diets historically, they never got on this nutrient kick. They never got on all that kind of stuff. They just simply grew and ate foods for wholesomeness. They didn't get bogged down in this worrying about all the details of nutrients. As scientists delve deeper into genomics, molecular biology, anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, pharmacology, on and on and on, we reflect ever less on the wisdom of the body as the originator, integrator, and manifestation of all these processes. As I said yesterday, the body was the first one of these things. We're just trying to study what the body does. But when you look in the human literature, it's even worse than in the livestock literature. There is never a mention of the nutritional wisdom of the body. Never one mention that anything like that exists or what its implications would be. Yet what I've been trying to argue for us and the animal in our cares is that in doing that, we fail to consider the most important point of all, one the body of every wild insect, bird, fish, or mammal that ever roamed this plant knows from its experience. The body was the first one of all things. The body knows what to do when given appropriate choices. With that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with all of you folks.